conversation home to Nigeria. The governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, that's Yemi Cardoso, says Nigeria's inflation rate would drop to 21.4% in 2024. That's amid rising prices of foodstuff and other commodities. Cardoso made the comments when he appeared before the House of Representatives on Tuesday to brief lawmakers on the sectoral debate on the economy. He lamented the high cost of living in the country, but noted that Nigeria's economy is now better than the stage President Bola Tinubu met it when he was sworn in on May 29, 2023. Professor Uche Uwaleke is Director, Institute of Capital Market Studies at Nasarawa State University, Keffi, and he joins us now to look at how realistic the promises of the central bank governor are, particularly on inflation hitting about 21% this year. Good afternoon, a very warm welcome. It's always great to have you on the program.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure.
Great. Now let's get straight into it. Now, we're well aware of the strategy of inflation targeting. But when we look at the components that he says will aid this inflation targeting, he referred to increase in agricultural productivity and the optimism at international global pressures easing. Now, we see what's happening with the current cost of living crisis. Just yesterday, the House of Representatives were asking for the national food reserves to be made available to the nation. And of course, globally, we know what's happening with the shipping routes and so forth. 21% inflation targeting based off of these realities on the ground. What is your take on this?
Well, I think it's possible, it's realistic to have inflation decelerate from the current peak of 28.92% as of December to 21% on the average, or 21% by December of 2024. If you look at the inflation trend since 1960, if you go back as far as 1960, you realize that inflation was highest in 1995 at about over 70%, and by 1997 it had climbed down to less than 20%. We also saw a similar scenario in 2005 when inflation rate was quite above 50%, but by 2007 it was also down below 20%. Inflation was actually lowest in 1963. That was when we experienced, if you like, negative growth rate in inflation. Negative growth rate in inflation is referred to as deflation, a situation where prices persistently fall. But of course, over the years, we've also seen cases of, disinflation, inflation rising at a lower pace. Why am I saying it's possible? Now, if you look at this trend, you also tend to see some commonalities in terms of the causative factors. All right. What are these commonalities? That I noticed. First is the fact that periods of high inflation, very high inflation, have been associated with high government borrowing. During periods of high government borrowing, we also had high rates of inflation. That's one. The second one too has to do with the exchange rate. Periods of very high inflation are also associated with periods in which the naira was very weak. So strong naira tends to support lower, exchange rate. And then the third commonality, one can easily notice, has to do with output. Okay, in the periods when inflation rate came down, those periods were associated with increase in output, particularly GDP. Now, in 1963, when I told you if we even experienced deflation, the economy experienced deflation, all right? These three factors, the borrowing was low, the naira was strong, and agri output was quite strong. Now, if you come down to 2000 and even before then, 1995, you saw that inflation rate, especially during the SAP years, 1986 when SAP was introduced, up to 1993, 94, 95, inflation rates were on the high side. But inflation rate came down in 1997 on the back of, the low borrowing, levels that we witnessed under Abacha regime, for example, there was no external borrowing. So that also helped to moderate, the inflation rate. Then you also take the case of 2005. In 2005, Nigeria exited the Paris Club debt of over 30 at the time, $30 billion US. So that also helped to moderate inflation rate. So the lag effect we saw by 2007 when inflation rate actually came down. As I said earlier on, inflation rate in 2005 was over 50% when we had those huge debts. But by 2007, inflation rate had come down, helped by the fact that, debt levels were low, and again, the exchange rate, started declining. So if you take these factors into cognizance, what the lesson from that is that first, the government is moving towards, fiscal consolidation. In other words, trying to reduce fiscal deficit by as much as possible. The other day, the finance minister was talking about relying more on, domestic, mobilizing domestic resources. So if they are going to rely less on borrowing, that should rub off positively on inflation. There's also the issue of agric, the agric output. Right now, agric GDP is very low. The growth rates in agric GDP, the last we saw, was just 1.33%. But with the plans to ramp up, agric production, the plans to cultivate 500,000 hectares of land, I think that will go a long way in boosting outputs and then ensuring that inflation rate is down. Remember, this inflation rate we are talking about, the pressure is on food. Food inflation is where we are having the pressure at over 33%. So if we can ramp up food production, especially including through dealing with insecurity that is preventing people from going to farms, also including through dealing with the enabling infrastructure, such as power. I'm pretty sure that the target of 21%, 21.4%, will be achieved. And then there's also the issue of exchange rates. I talked about 3 factors. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Of course, we do have a limited time with you. I know that the points you're raising are very crucial, but overall, when it comes to the presentation, there was an analysis that there seemed to be, the tone seemed rather contentious when it came to the executive and the legislative, that there's a relative difference in urgency, even though philosophy, even though they both agree on the urgency of the matter. So overall, the meeting, revealed a shared sense of urgency, like I said, but different visions on optimal economic solutions. How would you like to see a bridge in the divide, which will be pivotal in enacting these impactful policies?
Well, it goes without saying that for this to happen, there must be a very strong handshake between all the arms of government, between the executive arm and the legislative arm, and also between fiscal and the monetary authorities. The chairing news is what we had. Again, the minister, said the other day that there is a joint committee of both the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank that is always meeting, to look at these issues together. So that handshake is very important, and it should also be extended to also subnationals, talking about states and local governments, because some of these things may not be achieved except you bring them along. The issue of FAC is, comes readily to mind. These days, FAC receipts are usually in excess of 1 trillion naira. The states and the federal government need to sit together and agree on how to neutralize, part of the FAC that will likely ultimately result in inflationary pressure. And there's also the issue of, partly what I talked about earlier, the issue of borrowing and using the right instruments, to borrow. If you look at our domestic debt stock today, the instruments that we have used to contract domestic debt stock, the bulk of it has been FGN bonds. FGN bonds accounting for over 86% of those instruments. So we have not really used over time infrastructure bonds. if you look at that data from DMO, in the infrastructure component of the borrowing we have done, it represents less than 2%. Talking about Sukuk and green bonds of just 15 billion, Sukuk of about 742 billion naira. Now, you can imagine if already when you drive around this country, you see some roads with this signboard saying Sukuk, Sukuk financed road. Okay, and all of that has just been was just done with 742 billion. Now imagine if more money, for example, is channeled into that kind of infrastructure. All right, so not only roads but also power. By the time you fix roads and you fix power in this country, of course, the issue of output, you can be sure that all that will go into helping to ramp up. Ramp up output, and that will also have a positive impact, on inflation. So going forward, there is the need for both fiscal and monetary authorities to always agree on mutual targets, and I'm happy that the central bank governor is talking about a target of 21.4%, which is what we have in the 2024 budget. In the past, the central bank will have a target that's different from that of the fiscal authority. GDP targets too would differ. Because in the past, we've had the government say they are targeting GDP of, for example, in 2024 budget, 3.76%. The central bank will be targeting GDP of less than 3%. So such discordant tunes, should be avoided because it's one economy. The two must talk to each other and agree on really how to address many of these challenges.
And I'm glad you're making that point, about ultimately it's one economy. And if you look at some of the conversations, or rather listen into some of the conversations happening right now, there's a lot of fire being directed towards what I would call textbook economics. So people are saying that these policies are fantastic when you look at it from a textbook, from a theoretic perspective. But let's look at the two enemies that we're currently confronting, especially given the revelations that were made by the governor of the central bank earlier in the week in his exclusive interview with Arise: arbitrage and speculation. Can all of our textbook economics overcome the reality that this economy has been driven by arbitrage and speculation for so many years?
Yeah, thanks so much for this question. Now, I've always said, that has always been my position, that any policy we are churning out here in Nigeria must be adaptive, must reflect our peculiar situation. And it would be wrong, in my view, to say we are freely floating the naira, for example, because from theoretical background or theoretical basis, when you float the naira, you make your exports cheaper, and that's also encouraging exports. But of course, we also know, we saw all of that during the SAP years. It didn't work. It didn't work because, unfortunately, we have remained a monoproduct economy. So we cannot afford to say we are floating the naira. The central bank is, in my view, should be in a position to intervene from time to time. And that also brings me to what the central bank governor, was quoted to have said, that the challenge in the forex market today is liquidity problem. Okay, I think it goes beyond liquidity problem, because when people talk about liquidity problem, they often talk about the supply side, and that's why the central bank today is also doing whatever it can to improve this boost supply. We have seen the circular, for example, requesting banks or requiring banks to maintain zero, open position. So that has also helped supply. If you look at what happened on Monday and Tuesday in the FMDQ, for example, supply has been boosted. On Monday, I think the volume was over $400 million, and on Tuesday it went up to $540 or so million. So supply is increasing. But what have we also noticed? Okay, in spite of the increase in supply, only yesterday again we read that officially the naira also fell. Okay, still trading at over 1,400 and about 30 naira to the dollar. So what does that tell you? That tells you that the issue is not just about supply, because if you even succeed in getting supply, clearing your backlogs of over about, we hear now it's just about $2 billion, and providing money in that market, if you don't deal with the demand side, okay, the problem will still be there. So for me, it's beyond textbook. It should be, the reality is that it should be a double barrel approach. We are looking at the supply side. We must also look at the demand side, okay? Maybe I should, if I have, let me give you some statistics. In the 1980s, for example, in this country, the import bill, Nigeria's import bill was around $14 billion. Okay, in the 80s, total import bill. The food component of that was about $2 billion. By 2014, you know, what was the situation? It had jumped to over $60-something billion, okay, with the food component at over $14 billion, all right? And
all right,
so
Professor,
that will tell you that the demand pressure is there. Yeah, so we need to deal with the demand pressure. That's the point I'm making. It's not just about supply. There's also has to be demand, because if you don't deal with the demand, the leakages will still be there.
We'd like to thank you so much for your robust analysis, Professor Uche Uwaleke, who is the Professor of Finance and Capital Markets in Nasarawa State University. Thank you for joining us here on Newsday.